Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of ICRIER and UNU-WIDER, it gives me immense pleasure to welcome you all to today's seminar. Issues of economic inequality have always been a part of national and global discussions. Even the definitions and measurements of inequality have often been debated. Given its interlinkages with poverty, growth, political stability, conflicts, and environment, among many others, it is important to study and review trends in inequality to improve efficacy of relevant policies. To encourage discussions and debate on these issues, ICRIER and UNU-WIDER have jointly organized this afternoon's seminar, Inequality Trends Worldwide and in India. I would now like to invite Dr. Tarp, Director, UNU-WIDER, to give his welcome remarks.
Thank you very much for this kind welcome. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure for me on behalf of UNU-WIDER to wish you all a warm welcome to this seminar this afternoon, which has been organized in a very effective collaboration between ICRIER and UNU-WIDER. I'd like to extend my thanks to ICRIER, to its director, and to its staff for very good collaboration in preparing this event. As far as UNU-WIDER is concerned, we believe that these types of seminars cannot really be more pertinent than what we are seeing today. I mean, inequality is once again at the very center, at the very core of international development debates, and has really captured attention big time. And inequality really is a very difficult issue to discuss. There are lots of thorny analytical discussions, but there's also quite a big lack of actual knowledge of the facts. And we hope that we can sort of get that discussion going here this afternoon. Vis-à-vis developing countries, our worry is that while growth has certainly been achieved over the past 15, 20 years across the board, it has often been associated with increased inequality. And one can therefore argue that, well, does this then mean, or ask the question, does this then mean that the poor have not gotten their fair share of the benefits of growth? Now, is this true? Have they been completely delinked? Or is it a matter of time before we might begin to see things smoothen? In spite of the sort of public press to the opposite, it does actually, in a global perspective, seem as if interpersonal inequality, and I want to stress that, has gone down. So there are sort of contentious analytical issues and policy issues looming in the background. And I mean, just to refer to a few of them, is inequality good for growth, as some argue? How much inequality do we actually find acceptable? What can and should be done about inequality in the short, medium, and long term by people, by governments, donors, and the global development community? Now, UNU-WIDER's mandate is to help provide a neutral forum for professional interaction and the advocacy of policies leading to robust, equitable, and environmentally sustainable growth. And UNU-WIDER does have a long tradition for trying to invest in research and data gathering and inequality right from the earliest days, which is by now more than 30 years ago. We try to live up to this mandate, and I'd like to sort of invite you to have a look at the WIDER website and see what we did for the 30th anniversary conference. I'm sure that you will find quite a bit of material there, which you sort of, I mean, there's video material of some of the leading experts in the world, including leading Indian scholars and policy practitioners. Now, on a strictly personal note, I can't help add that I did my thesis in 1977-78 on growth and income distribution in developing countries. So I'd like to sort of just say that the issues that we are discussing today, I mean, they are indeed very close both to my own sort of heart, but also to my own attempts at trying to grapple with development issues. I've already sort of mentioned to why inequality is such a hot topic, but maybe I could elaborate on 2 points. I mean, WIDER's mandate dictates that we should carry out research on the conditions which affect the world's poorest people. Clearly, what happens to the poorest of the poor depends not only on the aggregate growth rate, it also depends on how income is distributed growth is, to put it simplistically, more poor if inequality is lower or redistribution takes place. François Bourguignon is a leading French economist and former chief economist of the World Bank, and he keeps reminding us that there is a definitional relationship between growth, poverty, and inequality. So it's important that we grapple with those relationships. Now, second, as economists, we do, rightly so in my view, worry about trade-offs. Some would say that this is in our genes, but it is not at all clear, especially in developing country contexts, that achieving more equitable growth and carrying out smart redistribution actually might lead to less growth. In fact, it might be the other way around, as argued in a number of the sort of general approaches to development. So what's the balance of evidence? Where are we now? I mean, it may be one thing what we found 30 years ago, but where are we now? A leading economist, the first author of the Human Development Reports, Jawarhal, he argued that, well, they taught us in our university quarters to take care of growth, and growth would then take care of poverty. Maybe, was his argument, maybe we should turn it around. Maybe we should just focus on dealing with poverty, and that would then in turn take care of the growth. How do we come out on this? It's important. It is really important in both research but also in practical policy how we actually see these things. Now, I have, on my side, I for one believe sort of a little bit more in walking on two legs in this. But I mean, this is my personal assessment of this. I'm not saying that this is the only way you can interpret it. But I sort of, for one, tend to think that all good things don't always come together when we discuss growth, environmental protection, climate change, and inequality and poverty. But, I mean, I do sincerely feel and think that synergies have a critical role to play in development, and we need to try to identify where they exist. Now, the UNU-WIDER 2014-18 work program is focused on what we refer to as the triple challenge on transformation, inclusion, and sustainability, combined with three cross-cutting concerns: Africa, gender, and foreign development finance. Now, this reflects the importance we assign to these issues, and obviously inclusion and inequality is sitting at the center. This also must be at the center of any sensible development agenda for the future. We did, therefore, in September of 2014, have a major conference on inequality, on measurement, where we discussed issues such as conceptual issues related to inequality, new ways of measuring, new data sets, and so on. I'd like to basically refer to those of you who wish to dig further into that after today, to say that there is actually quite a bit of exciting material sitting there on the website. WIDER has also, for a very long time, been at the forefront when it comes to the World Income Inequality Database. And in this seminar this afternoon, Professor Jukka Pirttilä will speak on the work WIDER has carried out to update the WIID. The WIID is, I believe, a unique service for researchers globally, but we have also, over the past couple of years, been working quite a lot on linking the WIID to a visualization component that hopefully should broaden the application of this database so that practitioners would find it easier to access. Another special topic we addressed in September 2014 was the development experiences from two of the BRICS, Brazil and South Africa. Both have experienced some of the world's most challenging conditions of inequality, and what we found in relation to South Africa is the progress on combating inequality has been very limited. This is, of course, discouraging for those of us who've been working for several decades in relation to South Africa, but it's actually a clear fact. South Africa is not seeing inequality going down, seeing it going up. In contrast, Brazil has been able to reduce inequality substantially in recent years. And we were, for example, in the conference I'm referring to, we were grateful that senior Brazilians joined us. there is a lot of fascinating material there. And it's nice that today we can put focus on what is happening in India. So the program this afternoon, after my welcoming remarks, Professor Pirttilä will speak on the WIID, this new database that has been updated very substantially. I will then give an overview of a recent UNU-WIDER study on global inequality trends, a study that has been based on the updated WIID. Professor Pirttilä will in turn give an introduction to his research on causes and consequences of redistribution in the world, also relying on the WIID. And finally and importantly, I mentioned that we were putting a focus on India. India forms part of a very important, from the wider perspective, 3-country study project that we have just launched. A study that will focus on India, South Africa and Mexico, and which forms part of a bigger project on what is referred to as inequality in the giants, trying to come to grips with what is happening in the major economies in the world. I'm therefore deeply indebted to Professor Himanshu from the Jawarhal Nehru University and to Dr. Rinku Murgai from the World Bank, who will contribute their research on India and help launch this UNU-WIDER project. This is really, for me, a particular pleasure that this is possible to do this afternoon. I'm really grateful that the two of you have joined us. Dr. Saon from ICRIER has kindly agreed to comment, and before Dr. Shankar Acharya from ICRIER will provide some concluding remarks, we will have time for open discussion that will be chaired by Dr. Ray. Until then, we will among us try to keep track of time. Thank you very much, and welcome to all of you. I look forward to a very interesting afternoon. Thank you.
Dr. Finn Tarp, Director, UNU-WIDER. Professor Himanshu from Jawarhal Nehru University. Professor Jukka Pirttilä, Research Fellow, also at UNU-WIDER. Dr. Rinku Murgai from the World Bank, Saon from our very own ICRIER. Let me add a warm welcome also, as mentioned by Dr. Tarp, to all of you to this seminar on inequality trends worldwide in India, jointly organized by UNU-WIDER and with ICRIER. I won't go into details of what ICRIER does. All of you know what ICRIER does, but we are very happy to be associated with this project because we think that inequality is grabbing much more attention in the world today, especially since the financial crisis. A lot of attention has been devoted to the research and study of income inequality. Because we live in times when income inequality is straining, as Dr. Tarp had also mentioned, is straining the achievement of welfare goals on the economic, political, and on the moral fronts. The statistics sometimes are shocking, sometimes. I mean, depending on how you kind of slice the data. But, you heard that 99-1 disruption in the United States. But there is some data from a recent study which shows that 62 richest people of the world, 1% of the richest 1%, own as much of the half of the world's wealth. At the same time, about 29,000 children under the age of 5 die every day, mainly from preventable causes, of which half are malnourishment and lack of access to safe water and sanitation. And which is why it's so important to ensure that the Swachh Bharat initiative is not just kind of superficial cleaning of our cities, but actually access to safe drinking water and sanitation and sewerage facilities. A host of factors such as slow economic growth, high prevalence of poverty and unemployment, lower health achievements, high incidence of crimes, conflicts and political instability, environmental degradation, and biases of public policy and democratic politics are associated with growing inequality between and within states. Income inequality can be caused by and be reinforced by inequality of opportunity based on gender, ethnicity, disability, and age, among other reasons. According to UNSCAP, the gap between the poor and the rich is widespread in the Asia-Pacific region and is still deepening for several economies, including that of India. So in addition to what Dr. Tarp mentioned about Brazil and South Africa, we have inequality as a concern in the Asia-Pacific as well. In India, in particular, estimations using the national sample surveys on household consumption expenditure show that for rural India, the Gini coefficient rose from 0.27 in 2004-05 to 0.28 in 2011-12. And for urban India, it increased from 0.35 to 0.37 during the same corresponding period. Income inequality also translates into fewer educational opportunities and therefore into fewer occupational opportunities, leading to intensifying of income inequality. Also, part of the widening income gaps can be attributed to, and we know this in India, perhaps, to weak labor laws and heavy reliance on capital-intensive technologies, which act as entry barriers to the bulk of labor force, which lacks sufficient education and requisite skill sets. So we've done quite a lot of work on the capital intensity and the jobless nature of our growth in India, especially over the past decade. Increasing income inequality may have gender-based implications as well. Welfare of females is likely to be higher in more egalitarian economies. Further empirical evidence claims that unequal distribution of wealth and power may result in greater environmental damage by undermining the collective action required for environmental protection. There is also a strong relationship between level of inequality and propensity to engage in civil conflicts. Just like we say in trade, often at ICRIER works, and we say that increasing trade engagement with other countries creates a constituency for peace. Therefore, besides direct transfer policies such as the Jan Dhan Yojana, improving infrastructure and provision of economic opportunities through appropriate and adequate social protection institutions, provision of better quality education at affordable prices, skill imparting programs, access to credit to the masses, and better healthcare provisions are important steps towards making a dent on the growing issue of income inequality. And, since a lot of you work and live in India, you must have heard the comments made by the governor of the Reserve Bank a couple of days ago in an interview when he said that, often the policies are in place, but what doesn't really happen in India is implementation. And he said the three major constraints for Indian economy taking off are implementation, implementation, and implementation. So while the policies may be in place, we have to improve the quality of our implementation and therefore the quality of our institutions and enforcement. But I'm sure that these issues will be discussed in the technical session that is about to follow. But let me reiterate that I'm extremely happy that ICRIER is collaborating with UNU-WIDER in this important area that has implications for the quality of our future growth. And I thank once again warmly Dr. Tarp and UNU-WIDER for giving us this opportunity to collaborate with them. And I hope this is not this is not the first, but I hope definitely we continue engaging on this important issue. Once again, I thank all of you for coming and now request Professor Jukka Pirttilä to make his presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and thank you for coming to this event. Now, as Finn already said, what we are going to do is to alternate it a bit, so that I'm going to first speak about the actual data set, and then we are going to present two research papers which have been conducted using the data set, one by Finn and colleagues, and another one by myself. So let me begin from presenting the actual World Income Inequality database, and I come back to the bit what I do in my own follow-up talk then later on, in the interest of time. So, what's the WIID? The World Income Inequality database, the WIID, is not an election, is a collection. There's a typo here, of information on economic inequality in all countries in the world. And this is freely available from the WIDER web page. So there have been various versions of the WIID. Now we have what is WIID 3.3. I come back to that in a minute. So we need to remember when analyzing income inequality or inequality that the Gini index, which is used most often for measuring income inequality, can actually mean very different things. It can be based on either on market or disposable income, or then it can be expenditure-based. Then it can include different notions of equivalence scales, or it can cover the whole population and area of a country, or only a subset of it. The main thing is that the WIID dataset gives all this information to the users. So by doing so, it enables research to actually make reasonable comparisons of inequality developments within a country and across countries over the years. And one final point to remember about the data set is that especially in developing countries, inequality data is gathered based on household surveys, and they don't take place every year. So the WIID doesn't do any imputations for the years in between the data collection exercises, unlike some of the other data sets. So we actually present the data, what's out there, and nothing else. Which is a fairly simple point, but this is something not every data set does. Now, last year, the Society for the Study of Economic Inequality organized an evaluation of all the cross-country data sets, or almost all of the cross-country data sets there are on inequality. And Professor Stephen Jenkins of the LSE did an evaluation of the WIID and another data set called the SWIID. And his basic conclusion was that the WIID is a credible source for work on cross-country inequality. And the main point was that this is precisely because the user can actually know what type of data he or she is using. Jenkins also had a number of very useful comments on how to improve the data sets, and they have all been incorporated in the latest version of the data, as we spell out in a response to his comments. This is joint work with Finn and Nina Padkayan, who's been also heavily involved in developing and updating the database. So what's available in WIID 3.3. So this is clearly the latest revision. It includes observations now up until 2013. It has some new sources which were not there yet in WIID 3.2. In addition, it has a bit of a simplified a set of categories for some of the background variables, like the equivalence scales and the area coverage, in addition to the more detailed ones. So it's a bit easier to use. And the main point also is that we now also offer a new visualization system of the WIID. So there should be a link in the PDF version. Now I was told that this computer is not online, so I cannot demonstrate it. But please visit the UNU-WIDER web page and go to the data section, and you land to the WIID page, and there you can visualize the WIID data and also make a query which enables you to not only to download the whole data set at once, but make a in a sense bespoke download of the data. So now I ask Finn to continue on his work on analyzing the world distribution of income based on the WIID data. Finn, please.
Thank you very much, Jukka. I mean, maybe I can sort of allow myself to add one comment, is that while it may seem sort of quite innocent when we are talking about a database like that, you should be aware that looming in the background are actually international debates of quite significant importance that depend critically on which databases they're using. I mean, some of you will have heard, for example, about the research papers from the IMF on a number of core issues that are looming in the background here. And the conclusion reached depend critically on which data you use. So this is, I mean, it's not quite as innocent as just talking about a database. Let me now turn to a paper that has been based on the WIID on global inequality trends, and I'm just going to focus on a couple of issues that we have in that regard. Now, I won't repeat myself from the beginning. I can refer to this link, which is from that September conference that I already spoke about. So if you want to have sort of afterwards, you want to try to check, well, what did he actually say, or did he actually mean what came across today? You can sort of cross-check with that link, and it is available on the wider YouTube. I do want to highlight that there is a wealth of information here, including that keynote by the Brazilian Minister of Strategic Affairs, which made a fantastic presentation on trying to understand what is going on in Brazil. It's probably the best and most detailed explanation as to what is happening in Brazil, and I really would encourage you to take a look. Now, obviously, as a point of departure from my presentation now is WIDER's strong tradition in work on inequality. We are trying to carry on with that tradition. It began with Amartya Sen more than 30 years ago, and it includes work by Professor Andrea Cornia and Tony Atkinson, as well as Tony Shorrocks, among many others. So it is a very strong tradition. Now, where should I begin today? How should I sort of try to intuitively present a part of the discussion that I'm going to point to? Well, I have over the last 15 years been working intensely on Vietnam. I actually just yesterday got a message from the OUP saying that they have now accepted a book on Vietnam that I am editing together with a number of colleagues. And basically, when you think about Vietnam, the annual aggregate growth rate on average has sort of been about 6.9% for the last 30 years. Now, that's sort of an interesting number for an economist, because we know that we have something that should always be in the back of our mind, namely T times G is equal to 69. T is the doubling time of any number. G is the growth rate. So if you grow by 6.9% per year, the doubling time of your GDP is 10 years. So if you think of Vietnam in 1986, 96, 2002, and 2016, well, those years are kind of interesting, because 86 was the year when the Doi Moi process started. 96 is sort of in the middle of the 90s, when sort of the Doi Moi reforms were kind of starting to bite or have effect. 2006 was the year just before Vietnam joined the WTO. And 2016 is sort of just on the edge of now seeing developments in the Asian Economic Community. So it's kind of interesting years. Now, if you were a person in 1986 that had $1 a day in income, well, then you had 2 in 96, you had 4 in 2006, and you had 8 in 2016, assuming that you got your average share of the average growth. I should say that in Vietnam, there are very strong indications that people have in general done that. They've in general gotten their average share of the average growth rate. In other words, that we haven't seen people getting worse off in absolute terms, but I mean, that is getting me off track in relation to this presentation. Now let's take another individual who in 1986 had $10 a day. There were some. Well, this person had 20 in 96, had 40 in 2006, and today would have and has $80. Now, there weren't that many people in Vietnam in 1986 who had $100 per day. There were some, there were a few. How much money would they have today in income per day? Well, $800, which is, of course, quite substantial. And there are some. Now, what would you take from this? Well, you would say that, wow, that seems as if inequality is exploding, right? Well, actually, by the normal standard measure that we use, namely the Gini, relative inequality has remained exactly unchanged. Because the relationship between 1 and 10, or 1 and 100, is the same as between 8 and 80, or 8 and 800. I mean, and this is an important point to keep in mind. And for those of us who study old Greek philosophy will know that even old Greek philosophers, they were pondering about how to understand absolute and relative understandings of the world. Now, another point of departure is a reference to the World Development Report done 10 years ago. Now, that was a fascinating report because I think it's fair to say that it was a point in time where a lot of this discussion about how you see overall growth and progress and equity issues addressed head on. And one of the quotes that I have from that report is that the dichotomy between policies for growth and policies specifically aimed at equity is false. I mean, that was stated in the World Development Report. And I think that links very clearly up with what was said by Professor Acharya in his opening remarks, and I think we should keep this in mind. Because the fact of the matter is that in our introductory development courses or economics courses, we often do make the assumptions that these things are and can be treated in a dichotomous way. That may be useful when we start in the first year courses, but the minute we move into the policy arena, we need to recognize that that dichotomy is not correct. The distribution of opportunities and the growth process, they are jointly determined. So what does this mean, also according to the World Development Report? Well, sound policy can involve redistributions of influence, advantage or subsidies away from dominant groups. Now then, another note in the report is, but good redistribution may not always be directly to the poor. And that was stated in that report 10 years ago. They referred to the fact that trade-offs may exist, and I believe that this is not an uninteresting reference, certainly not, if I understand the Indian discussion correctly, uninteresting reference to that. And there are, of course, looming even further back debates around redistribution with growth and versus basic human needs. Now, a lot of the arguments for inequality, that it's sort of a good thing, in quote, is because it supposedly leads to higher savings, more investment, and therefore more overall growth, and then down the road, the poor are getting better off. I think it's fair to say, if you're trying to sort of articulate the way in which we at WIDER would be thinking about it, is that, well, that's a very limited perspective. There are many channels through which inequality may affect growth and development negatively. Now, in addition to that, one should always keep in mind that equity should be perceived both as an end and as a means. So even if there might be some trade-offs, you may still choose more equity. Now, at the same time, I think it's fair to say that we would in general not reject that there is a need in many cases for market reforms, and the competitive market needs to play its role in an overall economic progress, at least sort of in general. Now, I took along this quote from the UN System Task Team from 2012, in part because I was myself a member of that team trying to work on the post-2015 development agenda. Now, if you read that quote, you will see that it's insisted here, the message which also came out of the World Development Report from 2006, namely that you cannot treat equity and growth issues as separate. You really have to think about it as one coherent set of issues that are interacting. So much by way of introduction. the paper I've done with Miguel and Larry basically asks, what are the most recent trends in global inequality? Has global inequality increased or declined? Have these trends been homogeneous across regions? And is the picture of global inequality trends using standard relative measures of inequality consistent with a picture using absolute measures? I should say here that the sort of real kind of pushing, I think, this literature forward is in the fact that we have basically really gotten ourselves engaged on the absolute measures of inequality. Think back at my introductory comments about Vietnam. And this paper is now forthcoming in the Review of Income and Wealth. Now, I won't say much about the sort of predominant relative inequality measures, but keep in mind throughout that when you see the development that I referred to in Vietnam, they would conclude that inequality has remained the same. Okay? So just keep that in mind. There are less commonly used absolutely inequality measures in the literature. I mean, one is the standard deviation. But here, the point is that here your statements about inequality remaining unchanged depend on whether you give the same income increase to people. So these measures will only stay the same if, in the case of Vietnam, that you had given for every year $1 more to everybody, independently of where they were in the distribution. There are very few studies that actually rely or try to use these types of measures, but the interesting thing is that in the public debate, I believe that they are often sitting in the back of people's mind when they are discussing inequality. And that's why I believe that economists should pay more attention to it. You could maybe also argue that sort of this discussion between relative and absolute, it's also a discussion between sort of more rightist and more leftist sort of approaches or way of thinking about it, but let me jump this. I won't say much about the data. Jukka has already done that, so let me now say a few things about the results. This is relative global inequality as it comes out of the WIID database, which is the best sort of available data set that you can get on these issues. By two standard measures, the conclusion you get here is that the Gini has actually, this is the blue line at the bottom, has actually had a relatively steady downward trend. Not a massive one, but it is actually trending downwards. And the coefficient of variation, well, it's sort of shown a bit more movement, but certainly from 2000 onwards, inequality by that measure is going down. Now, looking now at the absolute measures, in this case we've taken what is referred to as the absolute Gini and the standard deviation, trends clearly upward. So relative inequality going down, absolute inequality going up. I do not think that you should try to sort of absorb this full picture in all its detail, but I'm now going to show you a few slides on what is happening in different regions. Here, North America. Well, if you look at this and you just sort of kind of, what is this? Well, the general message of this one is that all of these graphs, they show an upward trend, all of them. Both the relative and the absolute. And there's actually also a measure in between, but leaving that aside, so in North America, what's the story about inequality? Not only absolute, but also relative inequality is going up. And that's clearly related to what Professor Acharya mentioned, that in the US, there is a very strong concentration of wealth, which I'm not talking about in this presentation. I'm talking about income or consumption. Take Latin America and the Caribbean. I mean, with the exception of the standard deviation, an absolute measure, in Latin America, sorry, I shouldn't say just the standard deviation, I should say the standard deviation and the absolute Gini, well, you do see a bit of increase, but not so much. all of the others show downward. So what you would get from this is that in Latin America, the general development is actually one of less inequality by the relative measures, even by the measures in between. And then, yes, absolute measures are showing a bit of increase, but it's not dramatic. And that, by the way, is the Brazil story as one illustration. There's also a wider OUP book on inequality in Latin America, edited by Professor Cornia, which you can refer to. East Asia and the Pacific, what sort of comes out here? Well, here you can see that there are quite a number of changes in trends. Europe and Central Asia, well, it's not so easy. South Asia, well, you will know that story. And then Sub-Saharan Africa, not much is happening. It sort of seemed to be quite kind of stable. This may be related to data quality, which is in general poorer in Sub-Saharan Africa. But we actually do have an OUP volume coming out that shows that the situation in the African cases is not as bad as often portrayed. I am told by Jukka that I should be aware of time, so I won't go into this slide in detail, but it's in the material distributed. And the point about this slide is there is a lot of heterogeneity within each of these regions. So Denmark saw increased inequality. I am Danish. I'm a bit sort of unhappy about it, that's for sure. But you did see other trends in other European countries, just to illustrate. Now, if you then try to say, okay, I mean, let's try and think about some counterfactuals, as how would these numbers have looked had we seen a different development in the world? And I'm going to show you some numbers from two counterfactual scenarios. One is where we're assuming all countries have the actual incomes and population sizes in 2010, but that they had the Swedish quantile shares. And then a second scenario, which basically is one where we then assume that all of the growth that took place in this period since 1975 would have gone into the pocket of those below the median individual. This is essentially a way of ensuring that it is really pro-poor. Look at these numbers, and that tells you something about how careful we need to be when we're looking at this. So the values, the absolute measures that you see here in 1975, so these are the absolute, these are the, oops, I can't do that. So at the top you have the absolute, at the bottom you have the relative. Now see here, if you make those really strong assumptions that I'm talking about, the absolute measure would still have gone up by two different measures. So what this suggests is that even under incredibly inequality reducing scenarios, your absolute measures go up. Because getting into a Swedish situation is not bad. But at the same time, you can also see this on the relative. You can see that if we've seen a development moving according to those two scenarios that I'm talking about, relative inequality would have gone down very dramatically. So there is something to try to think about when we are using these different measures in our discussions. Let me now wrap up. So, using standard relative inequality measures, global inequality declined. Now, this does not mean that we shouldn't be concerned about inequality, but it's, I think, important to get the facts right in our discussions. We find substantial heterogeneity trends across regions and within regions. And when we use absolute inequality measures, we find that global inequality has really increased quite dramatically. Think Vietnam. Now, Niels Bohr argued in his complementarity theory that with observations where we believe we see the same thing, we often see something very different, and therefore will very often arrive at different insights. I actually believe that this is sitting at the core of quite a lot of the misunderstandings in a number of the policy discussions that we see among different disciplines. And that's why I'm trying to make the point. The point is that these insights are not necessarily contradictory or meaningless. They are, yes, complementary. So taken together, what we do in our paper is to echo Atkinson's and Brandolini, who emphasize how central the choice of measure is to any discussion of what happened. And let me just to be absolutely abundantly clear, that the fact that I'm saying that relative global inequality has fallen does not mean that it's not high. It is high. It's unacceptably high. I should be very careful with time now, but why is it that it has fallen? Why is it that relative global inequality has fallen? Essentially because of growth in China and in India, compared to the developed world. And that is in spite of the fact that inequality has increased in both India and China. That may sound surprising, but that's actually the fact. So the growth you've seen in China, the growth you've seen in India, has only had a very modest dampening effect on the increased absolute inequality. Now, and this is where the sort of difficult conclusion is, okay, we've seen relative inequality falling, we've seen hundreds of millions of people getting out of poverty. It is an achievement. Would different policies have managed this without the increase in absolute inequality? And how do policymakers minimize the trade-off moving forward? And I think these are some of the kind of difficult issues that we should try to face with open eyes. Thank you for your attention.
I'm sorry I was a little late coming, but I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation, Dr. Tarp. I just had a question, because I think a lot of what one takes away from this talk, to my mind, depends quite centrally on the two alternative notions of inequality and equality, absolute versus relative. And as you, I think, quite rightly suggest, that most people, when they discuss this topic academically, are talking in terms of the relative one and not the absolute, and the absolute one is coming in through papers like yours and others. I have one problem with the absolute one, which I want to, at least one, a problem. Yeah, okay. I was trying to think about some of the regressive measures. I mean, your definition of absolute here is values remain, that is values in the inequality measure, remain unchanged when every income in an income distribution has the same income added to or subtracted from it. Now, I was trying to think of one of the most regressive public finance measures that I was taught 50, 60 years ago, which is the poll tax, or something like that, where basically if you take away 100 rupees, I'm using rupees, from every individual in India, turns out that, if I understand this concept correctly, that absolute inequality would not have changed. Whereas I would regard that as intuitively or otherwise highly regressive. So I just wondered how I solved that problem.
Let me be very frank that I have quite a series of reservations towards the absolute approach as well, and one of them is the one you exactly mentioned. But I do believe genuinely that what we as economists are doing standard, namely just focusing on the relative approach, also has its shortcomings, or at least that we need to be very explicit when we are discussing with other disciplines. And one of the motivations for this paper is actually that unrest, which is not sort of typically economists, but typically other aspects. They actually provoked in the lead up to our discussion about the post-2015, because they went out on a major campaign where they had not understood the difference between relative and absolute. And they were implicitly thinking in absolute terms. And that's part of the reasons why I'm trying to hammer this point. Do I have these reservations that you're mentioning? Absolutely. And I can be even stronger and say, I personally have never, in sort of whatever the 40 years I've been doing, seen a process where absolute inequality would not go up in any of the success cases I can think of. But I still think that it's important that we are very clear when we're talking about these types of issues.
Now, my study deals with redistribution. So this is ongoing work with Markus Jäntti and Risto Rönnkö. Markus is from University of Helsinki, and Risto is at UNU-WIDER and University of Tampere. Both of them are Finnish. So why study redistribution? So clearly, if inequality is a concern, then redistributing income is one of the quickest solutions that the government can take to try to influence this. I'm not saying that all policies wouldn't matter, like education policies, but these are a set of policies that should also be considered. So the study with Markus and Risto has 3 goals. The first one is to simply describe how much data have we got on redistribution, which we define as the difference between a market income Gini or gross Gini, if you like, and then net or disposable income or consumption-based Gini. In the WIID dataset, which is one of the most comprehensive or the most comprehensive dataset on inequality across countries. The second aim is to characterize what are the determinants of redistribution. So we try to explain redistribution using regressions, and in doing so, we also point out some possible problems in the earlier analysis of redistribution conducted in a similar way, and we try to offer a solution. And the third aim is to take these data issues very seriously and replicate an analysis to which Finn already alluded to in his introduction, if I'm correct, and because the IMF. Some of the IMF authors, Ostri, Berg, and Tsangarides, in 2014 published a study which gathered a lot of interest in the public regarding, and the study dealt with the impact of redistribution and growth in income inequality on growth. And we are replicating that using the WIID data, whereas they actually used something else. So, let me start by looking at the first aim, which is the simple descriptive analysis. So the main point to take away from here is that when we split the data into these 5-year periods, we have a relatively low number of observations. So at most during a 5-year period, we have more than 40 observations. So that means more than 40 for more than 40 countries. We have data in the world. There are more countries, as you know. The second point is that a huge majority of these observations come from the developed world. So the bottom part of these columns represent Europe first, the pink one, and then Americas, and then post-Soviet countries is in green. So in every year, the huge majority of observations on redistribution actually come from the developed world. And the number of observations goes even smaller if we make some restrictions to the analysis. For example, require that the equivalence scale used in the analysis in the calculations of gross and net concept of inequality is the same. So, unfortunately, we have quite quite little data on the on how much redistribution there actually is in the world. So if we try to visualize the data, here's a graph on the absolute redistribution. With absolute, I mean that this is just the difference between two Ginies. So the difference between a gross income concept and the net income concept. And here we see that the redistribution is at a relatively high level in the developed world. For example, does this work? It's the top. This one. Yes, thank you, Finn. So this should be Europe, and then that's followed up by post-Soviet countries, whereas in some of the developed world we have redistribution which is at a much lower level. For example, the 1 point there, we don't have data for Africa, but much data for Africa, but the one final observation there on 2010 is from Africa, and that's at the level of around 5 percentage point difference in between those two Ginies. I skipped the slide on relative redistribution in the interest of time. And let me now move to the analysis of the determinants of redistributions. So what do we do here? So we analyze what country characteristics are associated with redistribution. So we use 5-year averages because from the developing countries, data is not available for each year. And we explain both absolute and relative. So with relative, I mean just the redistribution divided by the gross income inequality. So that's defined as the gross minus the net income inequality divided by gross. By some economic and institutional variables, as well as what I call here inherent inequality, which is the gross income inequality. And in the model, when we pick data from the WIID, or in the regressions, when we pick data from the WIID data set, we do it using an algorithm, and we always favor high quality observations and use the common equivalence scale. So the relation to earlier work is that there are these earlier papers utilizing similar data sets, or even to analyze determinants of redistribution. They are motivated either by political economic concerns, as the work by Milanovic, or by examining whether some of the theories in analysis called optimal taxation carry over to the real world. And in the optimal tax models, a la Jim Merlees, the Nobel Prize winner, who did the initial work on optimal income tax, the government which is inequality averse should carry out more redistribution when the market income distribution becomes more unequal. So some of these papers are motivated by testing this hypothesis. So what is the value added in our work? So in our data set we have also data outside of the developed world. We include some additional right-hand side variables, and as I said, in particular we point out an estimation problem and some of the consequences of the estimation problem in the earlier work. So what's the estimation problem then? Well, it is the following. So researchers regress gross minus net, which is the redistribution, gross minus net Gini on a set of control variables, and then gross income inequality. So what this does is obviously creating a mechanical correlation between the dependent variable and the regressors. So that can lead to a bias, obviously. So what we do, we rather regress the net income inequality on gross inequality only, and adding controls and some of the other determinants. And then we do some calculations to deduce what would be the coefficient for the redistribution without any bias. we don't deal with the anything about the potential bias. So here the first columns 1 and 2 analyze absolute redistribution, and the columns following that 3 and 4 analyze relative redistribution. Models 1. All models include time dummies. Models 2 and 4 include also country fixed effects. And you can see that the inequality is redistribution is always positively associated with the income level. It's also positively related to the gross income Gini, and negatively related to the ethnic unity. So this is the ethnic fractionalization index. Excuse me, negatively related to ethnic fractionalization and positively related to ethnic unity. And moreover, in the models without country fixed effect, increased openness is associated with greater redistribution. So now, if we do the if we now pay attention to solving the correlation problem, as I mentioned, we regress net concept of inequality on the gross income inequality, and then then it can be shown that 1 minus the beta is now the coefficient of the gross income inequality in this regression, gives the unbiased estimate of absolute redistribution in the regressions I just showed you. And then it's somewhat more complicated for the relative redistribution, but that can be done as well under certain assumptions. And here the regression results, I realize they're a bit small, so you may not be able to read them, but they are also in the handout. So again here, we have a model with either with or without the country fixed effects. Model 2 is with the country fixed effects, and here what is interesting is the fact that the gross income Gini is strongly positively related to the net income Gini. So whenever market income inequality goes up, it's also reflected in the disposable income inequality, but the coefficient is less than 1. So some redistribution goes on. And then here in the bottom of the slide, I report the implied coefficients for the absolute redistribution in the typical redistribution regression, and the implied coefficient for the relative redistribution. So these should be now unbiased. And if we compare these to the actual results which I showed you beforehand, we are able to see that for some reason here in this particular example, I'm not saying that this is a general truth. Here in this particular example, if you like, the unbiased estimate of the absolute in the absolute regression is very close to the one which we had in the simple regression as was done before, whereas the implied coefficient for the relative redistribution differs more. So here's just to recap some of the observations based on these results. So GDP, we also carried out a log specification, so where the coefficients are then simply elasticity. So we find an elasticity of 0.3 from GDP to redistribution. The original idea, the Merle's idea, when inherent inequality or gross income inequality goes up, leads to more redistribution, gets stronger support. Surprisingly, this index which we used for democracy is not positively correlated with redistribution. The source is the Polity4 database. And the bias created by the mechanical correlation varied somewhat depending on the specific case. So now, whatever time I believe around 5 minutes I have, I now want to tell you about the replication of this IMF study on redistribution. So the study published in 2014 14 examined how redistribution affects growth. And the authors motivated it by this classic efficiency-equity trade-off. That we may not be able to get both of these good things at the same time. We rather need to choose to some extent at least between achieving greater equity or more economic efficiency. And they used macro data where growth was explained by gross income inequality and redistribution. And the results suggest that while inequality, the gross inequality has a negative impact, redistribution doesn't have any impact on growth. So there wouldn't be any trade-off after all. So the famous efficiency-equity trade-off would disappear using when we look at the macro data. So the trouble in the study, in our mind, is that the data for inequality, not surprisingly. Because it's not the WIID, then it's troublesome. So they use the WIID, which is developed by a person called Salt, and in the WIID, if there's no data for a given country in a given year, both the gross and the net concepts are actually imputed. And there can be countries like where there's only information on net inequality measured, if inequality is measured using consumption, then even in those cases, there are imputed values for redistribution. So I'm not claiming that we have all possible data in the world about redistribution, but we have quite a bit. We have done quite a bit of work to actually try to find the data, and we find much less information on redistribution than the WIID claims there is. And here's a comparison. So here the columns make a comparison between what the WIID has and what the authors of the IMF study used. For example, in the baseline sample, the second column here, they use more than 800 observations, whereas from the WIID we can find less than 300 observations. So that means the huge majority of the data points in the IMF study are actually imputations or guesses. That would be another name for that. So it's very kind of the IMF authors that they share their code, their data code, so we can easily replicate the analysis. So what we did was to exactly take their code and the WIID data and rerun the analysis. And it turns out, in fact, that some of the results changed. So growth is not anymore negatively affected by gross income inequality, as it was in their analysis. But the coefficient on the redistribution actually remains non-significant. So this is important in my opinion, because in the original analysis, the absence of significance could just have been an artifact of the fact that there was a measurement error in the variable itself. Now there's, at least in our opinion, there's less of a measurement error there, because this comes directly from the actual observations from the countries in the same year on gross and net concepts. So I don't know if you can see here, but here we replicate the basic IMF analysis in the first column, then we rerun the analysis using the WIID data set. The number of observations goes dramatically down. These are with country fixed effects. And these are GMM estimations, as in the original study. And in the middle column, we take those years and countries for which there is WIID data and rerun the analysis using the IMF data, this WIID data. And even then the results change. And they change towards the same direction, not surprisingly, because in those years, in the WIID, the imputations would be fairly good because there's also underlying a data point. So the results in the two latter columns are similar. So net inequality is not associated with growth, and neither is redistribution. Obviously, this could be due to the fact that the sample size is small, but this is the largest sample size we can get out of the WIID. So let me conclude. Unfortunately, data on redistribution is very patchy for the developing countries. Some of the earlier research conducted on redistribution and its impacts needs to be interpreted fairly cautiously because of problems in the methods. Based on our analysis, redistributed efforts are strongly linked with economic development. So the richer the countries become, they tend to redistribute more. So that, in a sense, has double impact. So both the mean income level goes up, and then also the efforts to redistribute that growing income also go up. We know that there's some redistribution in the world going on because of, for example, official development assistance, but the impact of that at a global scale on world inequality is relatively small. So I think if you try to come up with the policy implication of our results, is that once the country is developed, if we care about the world inequality, there's clearly a need to build a comprehensive social protection systems and also finance it with some fairly functioning tax system. So I think I'm done now. So proceed.
Thank you very much, Jukka. I think this does point to some rather interesting discussion at the sort of global policy discussions, because the IMS has found it necessary to produce a study that claims significance in order to argue for a policy. This study suggests that we may actually, as academics, as researchers, we may actually not be able to claim that significance, statistical significance, is actually there in the data when you really do the analysis. But it's important to take note of the fact that this does not imply that you may not want to pursue the same policy. I mean, I just sort of wanted to highlight that because I think that's really important. But let's move on. Professor Himanshu, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Finn, for giving us the opportunity to present this, and Rajat. I think the broader story has already been highlighted in international context. My job is to bring it the same issues to what we know about India. And there is a problem. There is a problem in the sense that we don't have too much of data as far as inequality trends are available in India. We definitely don't have any income data, but even other indicators. So the idea has been to give you some kind of an update on the state of knowledge on what we do know about inequality using different data sources, and in some senses, what are the trends at least in the recent 2 or 3 decades. So I'll straight off go to something this is well known to all of you, which is that we are now in a different context. Our growth rates are now dipping. Some people might disagree, but a majority of the people do agree that we are now, in terms of growth rate, not doing so well. And this is also more or less well known. I mean, there's not much of a dispute on these numbers, that our consumption inequality, which are coming from the National Sample Survey consumption data, have been showing a secular increase since 1993. So roughly around 2 decades that we had an acceleration in growth rates has also been a period when inequalities have gone up from the National Sample Survey consumption data. But then a lot of people do have problems with that data. But more than that, I think the issue is that consumption inequalities do underestimate inequalities, and therefore they're not comparable with the numbers that we get to see in other countries. We go to the other indicators of it, but just to give you a little bit more detail than simply the estimates of Gini that were presented in the earlier graph. If you slice the data in various ways and look at what is happening to the share of various groups, this is bottom 20%, bottom 40%, top 20%, top 10%, and very clear trend from 1983 onwards up to 2011-12. The share of the bottom 20% and the bottom 40% has been coming down. The share of the top 20% and top 10% has been going up. And this is kind of a secular trend. If you try and get an idea of average consumption of various groups by deciles, again, you get a very, very clear picture. Whether you do it by urban top 10%, by rural bottom 10%, urban top 10 by bottom 10, urban top 10. I mean, you can do it in various ways. And the idea is basically that all the consumption numbers, irrespective of what you are looking at, do show a rise in inequality. But we do have numbers on income inequality, not many. We have some data now, privately collected. And these are data that comes from the NCAR's Indian Human Development Survey. The last one that was there was in 2011-12. But before that, we also had the data in 2004-5. And that number basically suggested that our inequality numbers are not as low as we would generally think based on the consumption numbers. They're actually pretty high. And they're high enough to put us in the league of countries with a very high income inequality numbers, possibly with some exceptions in Africa and some exceptions in Latin America. But majority of the country, we will be in the top 10% of the countries in terms of the income inequality numbers. So that's the level that we are talking about. And the last number that they released in 2011-12 shows that even on income inequality, the inequality numbers have gone up. They have not gone down. So now it is 0.55 that we have seen in 2011-12. So we are a very high inequality country. We, if you want to kind of look at what is happening to interstate inequality or regional inequality numbers, these are from Montek Singh Ahluwalia's paper. Look at the numbers in 1980s. We are roughly flat. This was a period when inequalities were not rising. And you'll find the same numbers that is coming from Gini ratios or various other things. After 1990s, we have seen inequalities go up, and they have gone up dramatically from 1990 to roughly around 2009-10. You extend it by a little bit, you get the same numbers. But I think the other way to look at it is to basically look at what is happening to, from, say, national accounts. And what national accounts gives us the data on factor incomes. And those factor incomes can be basically broken down into different groups. So this is what I'm presenting here as factor incomes broken down by sector and by category of workers. So you get agricultural wages, non-agricultural wages, self-employed in agriculture, various categories. And these are available for 93, what I'm presenting here from 93 up to 2011-12, the last year for which we have data on corresponding from data from the employment surveys. And you get the same number as the number of workers in the employment numbers. The factor shares, the numbers that you had from the national accounts very clearly show you, and that's something what you get to say, is that the brown one, which goes up from 7% to roughly 15%, that's private surplus. That's the number what you see as the private surplus. The green one is what you get as the agriculture, self-employed in agriculture, which is generally the share of agriculture in the GDP kind of. And these are the employment numbers, roughly corresponding to the same categories. We do get information in the national sample survey, employment and unemployment data, by disaggregated categories. You can get it in, use that numbers. And if you divide those, you can get some kind of an idea of per worker productivity. And this is what happens between per worker productivity in using the national account data and using the employment numbers from the national sample survey. The two top lines that are diverging are basically your private salaries and the government salaries. The sharp shift that you see in the government salaries around 2007-8, that's the pay commission effect. You're going to see another pay commission effect now in some time. So you'll again see a sharp upward rise as far as the government salaries are concerned. But generally, the government salaries and the private salaries, the regular ones, have been moving, diverging. On the other hand, all others have been really bunched together, all other categories of it. And remember, the two that we are talking about, private salaries and government salaries, they're less than 5% of the total number of workers in this country. Now, this is something which is there from, if you don't have problem, I mean, you don't trust the national account data, look at the ASI data. ASI data gives you the numbers on what is happening to workers' wages per day and managerial emoluments per day. From 1980 to up to around beginning of the 1990s, you had more or less both of them going parallel, start diverging in the 1990s, and by 2011-12, you have a sharp divergence appearing between managerial salaries on workers' wages per day. And that's something which is there from the annual, this is the organized manufacturing sector that we're talking about. This is what you get from the profits and wages data that you get in the national accounts. What we are talking about, the private surplus doubling in the last 2 decades, the share of profits going up, the national accounts data. This is the same data that you get from the ASI data, the Annual Survey of Industries data. And the Annual Surveys of Industries data suggest the beginning of 1980s, roughly around 30% of the net value added was going to wages, and less than that, around 20% was going to the profits. By 2011-12, we were roughly around 60%, 55 to 60% going to profits, and only 10%. So the share of wages went down by 1/3. The share of profits went up by 3 times. So that's the reversal of that. So the profit share went up. During the same period when productivity was going up, the share of workers were benefiting very little compared to the other. You want to see it from the national accounts, you get the same data. Again, this is now including organized and so this is now including not only the manufacturing sector, but also the services sector. So this is something which is a trend which you get to see from the, again, using the factor shares from the national account data. And this again is well known. Our growth rates have been, we are now accelerating. We have already beaten China. There's no other country to beat now. But we know it very clearly that our employment numbers are now flat. Between 2004-05 to 2011-12, we just had 14 million people added to the workforce. And that's the lowest in any period that we have seen from the time that the data is available on number of people added to the workforce. This again is very well known. What is not well known is that a majority of the workers which we are adding or who are already there in the workforce are basically, even if they're in the organized sector or good quality employment, are now becoming informal worker, which is workers without any social security benefit, without any health benefit, without any paid leave, without any. So the quality of employment has also gone down. Not only the economy has not created quantity, but even existing quality has gone down. And this should not surprise many of you that 2/3 of the job in the private organized sector are informal sector workers. So the private organized sector, which is the so-called the dream job scenario, that itself has around 2/3 of people who are working as informal sector worker. We have seen in my universities where a majority of jobs in the class 3 and 4 have become now contractual workers, with workers working overtime but not getting paid enough. This is happening not just in informal sector, but also happening in organized private sector. Some part of that is the employment structure has changed, and that's something which I think is good for the economy. For example, the number of people who have shifted out of agriculture and people who have gone to non-agriculture has gone up, and that's a big structural change that we are seeing in the labor market. We have seen number of female workers go down dramatically after 2004-05. Part of that may be simply because women are now going more to the education sector, and some of them may be simply because of the income effect. But the fact does remain that we are the country with the lowest female workforce participation rate, even compared to Bangladesh and Pakistan. We are the lowest. Very few African countries have lower than our workforce participation rate, but that's not the point. The point here is that we are now have gone into some kind of a trajectory where we are shifting people from agriculture to non-agricultural sector, which is good. But where are we shifting them to non-agricultural sector? We are actually putting them from agriculture to non-agriculture in informal sector, in poor quality work. Majority of the people who are going into the non-farm sector are people who are basically in casual employment, casual or daily wage, or what we call as the daily wage workers. Those are the people who majority of them are going. 2/3 of the new jobs which have been created in the non-farm sector, and some of them have people who have shifted from agriculture, are actually people who are employed as casual workers, daily wage workers. Not even forget about regular workers or getting some kind of benefits. They're simply wage workers doing head loading, doing various other kind of things. In the rural areas, manufacturing is generating, the share of manufacturing in the total employment has gone down over a long period of time now, almost like 3 decades that we are talking about. The number of manufacturing share in the employment has gone down, which was the one which is basically absorbing majority of the people in the non-farm sector. It's construction. And we know the quality of construction. And out of 5 survey years that we have, in 4 survey years, the households who are engaged in construction have a poverty level in most of the states. In some states, they're better off, which is lower, which is worse than in people in agriculture. So it's not that construction is something just simply because you're going to agriculture to non-agriculture and you're now in construction worker, you are now better off. That's not the case that we have. But I think the issue is that majority of people are moving from bad to worse or from bad to bad. There is hardly any improvement in terms of employment quality. Your organized sector, the backbone of the economy, hasn't contributed much to the employment generation. Public organized sector has seen a decline, little bit improvement in your private organized sector, but the total number of workers in organized sector from 1995 to 2011 that we have hasn't changed much. It used to be close to around 300, and it's still around that. It hasn't created much job in the organized sector employment. So we haven't seen that sector creating much of the employment. But the organized sector has become more profitable, and it is generating more and more profit. How is it generating? The percentage of contract workers in organized sector has almost doubled in just 10 years. In just 10 years, from 2000 to 2012, the percentage of workers, contract workers in the organized manufacturing has gone up from around 20% to 35%. So that's the level of, that's the trend of towards employment diversification. Obviously, there is some good news, and that good news is that the real wages of casual workers, people who are at the bottom end of the distribution, did see some kind of a rise in wages after 2007-8, and it did have some impact on poverty, and poverty did reduce dramatically after 2004-5. I mean, at least the pace of poverty reduction. But that's also because of various other things, including a large amount of redistributive transfers that happened after 2004-5, but also because wages went up, agricultural terms of trade shifted in favor of agriculture, various other things. I'm not getting into that. But the point that is here is that even among wage workers, and this is urban male irregular workers, sliced by education categories, you can see it very clearly that the urban male graduates, so if you're a graduate and above, you experience a much higher rise in wages, the kind of picture that you get from the ASI, where managers were getting much higher wage rise compared to the workers. You could get the same kind of a picture from the NSS, urban regular workers. So the wage premium which is there of being higher educated, graduate and above, they are the ones who are cornering majority of the wage increase that has happened over a period of time. If you try and get an idea of all other regular workers, less than graduate and educated and above, between 1999 to 2011, their wages, real wages, hasn't increased much. Their real wages hasn't increased much. Majority of the increase is basically among people who are graduate and above. That obviously has led to some kind of increase in inequality, and this is what you kind of get a rough idea of what is happening to Gini of workers' income. It did increase from 93 onward to 2011-12, slight decrease in 2011-12. That's because the wages of the casual workers in the rural areas went up after 2008, and that led to some decline in inequality. But overall, the trend has been that of increasing inequality even in workers' income. We don't have much data on wealth data, but some data that is there on wealth data, and this is based on the All India Debt and Investment Survey. And my student was working on this. I'm using the data from them. If you look at what is happening to inequality, which is based on the wealth data, then again, very clear picture. Between 91 to 2002, slight increase. But 2002 to 2012, there's a sharp jump in inequality in asset and wealth, the Gini with the asset and wealth. But what is happening here in terms of the share of total top groups in total wealth? We are not yet where 1% and 99%. But just to give you a rough idea of it, top 1% by the National Sample Survey, All India Debt and Investment Survey data on assets and net worth, the 1% now is close to around 30%. It's inching towards 30%. It was less than 20% between 1991, 2002, and it has jumped massively by 2002. Top 10% now are accounting for more than 60% of the total wealth held by the households in. Remember, this data is from the All India Debt and Investment Survey, and it does miss out a lot of data which is in assets or assets or property, assets or financial assets, assets which are held in form of financial assets. So it does miss out. So this is a general complaint that is there, that it does miss out on financial assets. But these are basically assets which are more or less physical assets. So you'll have land, housing, and durables and those kind of things. But even in that, the picture is very, very clear. Whether you take 1%, 5%, 10%, whatever you do it, you get the same kind of a picture that the share of that is basically going up. What is happening to by social groups? One way to look at it is what is their population share and what is their total share in the total assets owned. If it is 1, that means you are basically having the same share in assets, same share in population. So that's something which is the desirable if every group. That obviously is not the case. For the scheduled tribes, it goes down. It was already 0.4. It has gone down by 2012. For the SCs, again, lower than STs, but it has gone down. But even for OBCs, it has gone down. And remember, all this period, there had been so many efforts of redistribute, affirmative action, and various other things. Despite that, the share of assets held by the SCs and ST relative to their population has gone down. On the other category, on the other hand, the general category, which is the non-SC, ST, and OBC group, their share in the total assets have gone up. It was already very high, around close to around 1.5 or 1.6 in 2002. Now it has crossed 1.8. So now they have almost like double the share of their population in the assets. So financial assets, what do? We have some data on the Forbes. They give you some kind of a thing, a very, very crude kind of a data. So if you kind of sit through the Forbes data and try and aggregate the assets that are held, these are financial and physical. But the idea is to give you some kind of an idea of what is happening to the the billionaires in that sense. And this is what is happening to the billionaires. Their share in total GDP, again, it's a capital, stock and flow issue, but this is more kind of indicative rather than exact numbers that we are talking about. The numbers, the share, the total valuation of local Indian billionaires as a share of GDP starts rising somewhere in the end of the 1990s, shoots up dramatically when there's a boom, fell after the financial crisis in 2008. After that, it's not there in the data, but it has remained around 6 to 8%, roughly around that. It has gone up and down. Now it is going a little further. So now it has gone down, and it is less than 5% now. But remember, it was less than 1% before the 1990s. Where are the billionaires and where are they making money? Very crude kind of an analysis. In 2010, there were 69, 2009, 49, and only 13 in 2004. So between 2004 to 2010, roughly 5 times increase in billionaires. We just divide the billionaires, go to the exact categories, which industries they're holding, where they're getting basic income. You basically make it rent thick, which is basically coming from mining, metal, construction, land, real estate, and so on, and spectrum, obviously. And then finally, we go to those which are knowledge-based industries. Again, we do really well on that. Also, IT sector, for example. Every time we talk about India's growth story, it's the IT sector. So we know the IT sector is the one which is there. And then we have the pharmaceuticals, again, where we're doing very well. What is happening to them? In 2004, of the 13, 2 were in pharmaceuticals, 2 in IT. So roughly 4 out of 13, so 1/3, it was basically there. In 2010, out of 69, we had roughly the same number. But there were 18 in construction and real estate, 15 just in real estate alone, of which the 2010 number of the numbers that we had, A15, 2 of them were indicted and put in jail, although the cases are still going on. But then there were various in commodities and various other things. The total wealth of the IT industry billionaires were 55 billion against 132 billion for the rent-thick sectors. Services were only 20%. Remember, services are the ones which are driving this country's growth, but they're only 20% in the billionaires' wealth. All 15 have joined the billionaire club in the real estate one between 2005 and 2010. All 15 which came in the new ones. Little comparison with the US. Per capita income, US 45 times, and almost 15 times in PPP terms. Net wealth of the 100 richest is 836 billion. This is in 2010. And 100 richest is not far. So we are, in terms of per capita, we are 145 or 115, whether you take nominal or PPP. But in terms of the billionaires, it's only 1/3. So we are inching closer to them. We are 8 among top 100. In 2010, there was none from China. I'm talking to now a lot of Chinese billionaires are there. So if you do the same exercise for 2015, you'll probably find a lot of Chinese billionaires in this. But of the 20 billionaires in the US, 8 were from the IT sector, 3 from finance, 5 from retail, and only 1 from media. Of the remaining 3, only 2 from engineering and 1 from real estate. So that's the top 20 in US, and we had the top 69 that was given there. And you know about the other billion, I don't have to repeat there, that we have, which is what Rajat was talking about. We are the country with the, whatever indicator that you take it, whether in terms of gender, we talk about nutrition, we talk about open defecation, we are talking about anything else. The other billionaire, the billions, they are seeing a smaller progress than what the other billions is. And in fact, we have the achievement that not only we're top on the growth rate, but we also top from the bottom in terms of PISA ranking, in terms of the global hunger index, and various other indices. So that's the dichotomy I think I wanted to point out. But let me come back to last few minutes, and which is basically that a lot of these issues are now coming from the village surveys also. So you don't have to, because a lot of these large-scale data show you numbers, but you can't go beyond those numbers. And this is 2 slides that I want to present from longitudinal work that we have been doing in Palanpur, which is a village in UP. We have been following it for now almost 7 decades. And we have exact data on this particular village for about almost like 7 decades. Very carefully and detailed data collected with Peter Lanyau and Nicholas Stern. We have been following this. even in this village, if you were the kind of, and we have done a very detailed calculation of incomes and those kind of things, there is an increase in income inequality that we see, and very consistent with the national trend that inequality fell after 1960s, up to 74 there was, and then again up to 1983 there was some minor increase, but it was not so much. But after that, there has been an increase in inequality even at the village level. And we do find that this increase in inequality has been accompanied by whatever we have talked about, the increasing share in non-farm, and all those things are important there. But we do find that there is some mobility. It's not that, so the average rise in incomes has led to the poorest also being participating in the process. So there is some positives that have come in. The Jatabs have moved into, from agriculture to non-agriculture. But again, where have they moved into? They have moved from agriculture to brick kiln. They have moved from agriculture to head loading. They have moved from agriculture to various other kind of things. But there is some mobility. So there is, the point is that there is some mobility, and they are now, at least the processes, last 10 years, we have seen the process getting halted. I think that, let me conclude by saying that what was, the idea here was to basically show you what is the state of knowledge. I mean, and then there is a plethora of data which is available, and we already know so much about what is happening to inequality in that sense. It has become now center stage. Yesterday, Piketty was there in JNU, and he was talking about more data that is to be available. And his fears are not incorrect. And one of the things that he talked about, that the more we talk about inequality, the government doesn't attack inequality. It starts attacking people who are working on inequality, because the tax data, which was basic building block of Piketty and Banerjee work, 1950 to 2000, on inequality in India, the tax data got stopped after 2000 when the paper came out. That's what his guesswork was. I don't know how much of that is true. But we do know that the government, when it finds the data uncomfortable, it can come back to you. The NFHS data, for example, when the malnutrition numbers became very important, instead of having it in 5 years, it was pushed to 10 years. And that is also a lot of persuasion when the government had to finally accept of doing the NFHS data, because the numbers were not comfortable. This happened with the rapid survey on children. When the government tried to stop the data, the Economist magazine brought out the entire data set on its website. Then the finally government. But I think there is huge amount of information which is already there, and there is hardly a dispute on what is happening. In which way inequality is increasing, which direction it is going, and which dimensions of inequality are increasing, whether it is rural, urban, by caste groups, by gender, by regional profile and sub-profile. I think those information are available. And I think the idea is to basically take it deeper, take it more and more deeper, and broaden it as much as possible. And in fact, much of the discussion that we have seen on inequality in the international context, Piketty obviously is a big contributor to this whole thing. But remember, the book doesn't have much about China, India, or developing countries. It is basically about industrialized country, the kind of database that is there. But I think the important issue that we should be asking, and that is, I think, where Finn was hinting at, is about the processes. What are the processes which are generating inequality, and in what ways can we have a system where we have growth with reducing inequality, with reduction in poverty, and how do we basically get into that? Are there successful models, or are there ways in which these things can be done? And in some cases, questioning, revisiting the whole Kuznets hypothesis, that inequality is inevitable when countries start growing, accelerations. Is that something which we've taken as a given fact, or do we start looking at the issues again and again? The project is about understanding inequality in emerging countries, particularly in Africa, Latin America, and India, but also try and understand from the lessons of the industrialized countries or developed world. And the idea is not just to go in the standard measures of it, for example, on the consumption and income, but also to go deeper, or not just on the trends and inequality and dimensions, but also in terms of processes. And that probably will require not only looking at the secondary data, but also looking at primary data. So this is the kind of, we are the team members who are planning to do it, and obviously Finn will be guiding us through the process. Finally, what will be the outcomes? At some point of time, we hope to share it whenever the project outcomes is there, is to get a very, very credible time series of inequality trends in different dimensions. Not just, we didn't present anything on health, education, and nutrition, but I think we do have those numbers, but the idea is not to mention it. I think this is sufficient enough to give you an idea of what was going on. But the idea is to basically use different measures of it and then kind of get a coherent picture of what is happening to inequality in the country. and get some kind of a profile of inequality by different groups, by states, by districts, to whatever level possible, using different ways. For example, using new data on satellite data which is available, or for example, different data, census data and other data is available. The SECS data is, in some ways, broad ways is available. To use those kind of data to get a finer picture of what is happening to inequality by different groups, by reasons and sub-reasons. And at the same time, we also would like to understand the processes and outcomes in detail by combining the secondary as well as the micro data. A lot of village surveys are there, a lot of other surveys are there, privately held surveys are there. IHDS is a very good example which has filled up the gap, the NFHS is there. Various other surveys to kind of get an idea of what is it that is creating this, whether it's the labor market outcomes, whether it is the labor policies, or it is related to fiscal policies, redistributive policies. I think we need to bring those together to get an idea of what is happening to inequality. And finally, the idea is to, what Finn was talking about, to situate these, at least the findings from the India and the other developing countries and the fundamental questions that we are talking about. I mean, how do we achieve higher growth without compromising on inequality, without compromising on basic public services, without compromising on basic, what we call as the elements of a citizenry, which is health, education, nutrition, and other aspects of citizenship. The idea is basically, and I don't know how much we'll be able to do it, but we do attempt to bring in as much as possible, not only new techniques, new measurements, new data, but also new kind of analysis to improve the understanding on inequality that we have. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this very clear presentation, Himanshu. One sort of sits here thinking about the transformation processes in India, and you sort of ponder about that they actually in many ways are quite sort of remarkably similar to what we see in a number of African countries. Namely, you do see agriculture employment going down, you do see people moving, but where do they go? They do not follow the model, the dual model that most of us, at least those of us who are in the elderly part of the group here, they don't follow the dual model. They go horizontal into lower productivity service jobs. They don't go into those manufacturing jobs with high productivity that we were sort of used to think would be there at the other end. But thank you, Himanshu. You did great. Thank you. And now, Saon, your comments, and basically you are now the boss.
Thank you, Dr. Tarp. My comments will be very brief based on the three presentations that you heard, so that there is some time for Q&A. So the string through the three presentations that we heard, we are talking about inequality, of course, but Dr. Tarp's presentation, for example, talked about the importance of the inequality that we are talking about, whether it is absolute or relative, and it is very important to be careful about what you are measuring, because depending on what you're measuring, you can get a certain kind of conclusion. Dr. Pirttilä's, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it correctly, his presentation talked about the database that he's used, the WIID, and based on that, the kind of extensive empirical work that he and his team have been doing. And essentially then talking about whether you talk about relative or absolute inequality, what are the determinants of this inequality? And in fact, he has really talked about some of the deep determinants that are there in the literature, and found very interesting signs for some of them, the democracy, the ethnic fractionalization, etc. His presentation then talked about the role of redistribution, and this is where, in fact, I'll talk about in the context of Himanshu's paper as well, is that where does all of this, in fact, boils down to how we view redistribution and the policies that are needed for redistribution. There is, in fact, a great debate on doing the redistribution the correct way, and unless that is done, there can be a lot of problems. Himanshu's paper essentially talked about the kind of inequalities that India is Indian data is showing, and he essentially pointed out that most of the inequality that is being measured in the country is based on consumption. And then, of course, he presented a wealth of information on all kinds of inequality, the wealth inequality, the income inequality based on the IHD survey. And then his paper, in fact, has also talked about other kinds of inequality that are there in the country in terms of asset holdings, in terms of the access to education, access to based on caste, gender, religion, etc., spatial location, etc. Now, what all this boils down to then is the question about, and also given the fact that India is a very unequal country, where do we go from here? How do we actually look at inequality? What are the measures we take to improve the situation? And that is where the role of redistribution and how we do redistribution becomes very important. And in fact, I'll throw this to the panel, in fact, and get their views on this. But I'd end here and open the floor now to the questions. You can ask the questions to any of the panel, and we'll take it all together. Thank you.
I have a question to Himanshu, actually. I was just wondering what kind of policy would change the inequality trend?
My name is Bohidar, Natranjan Bohidar, and I run a very modest initiative that I call Democracy Within a Continuum. And I'm very happy to find that Jukka Pirttilä brought up democracy as a non-factor, in a manner of speaking. But my question is, Himanshu and Ms. Murgai, we don't have your presentation in our docket. Is it that my docket doesn't have it, or can we have your presentation in our, or some way we can access that, or? Nobody has it. Except you. There's no discrimination. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, but can we have equality in having your presentation all around? Yeah, so could you? Okay. I like to read your line. You said that surprisingly, the extent of democracy is not positively correlated with redistribution. That's your line, sir. Could you define what is extent of democracy? How do you quantify that? And what does this sentence actually mean? In the sense that, do you believe the democracy is not working, or should you go back to the colonial times? Or, as the lady asked, what would be a future policy? So some comparisons in blocked dates, yeah.
I have some comments and questions. I'm Shinozaki from JICA, Japan International Cooperation Agency. First of all, the factors which affects inequality in the air probably is a little bit different from that kind of inequality in the United States or in Europe. Because so when we see the labor comparison by industry or by sectors, so in India, some mention in the paper, they say that it's almost half of the labor in agricultural sector, and the productivity of agricultural sector is quite low, and low increasing. Increasing rate is very low. And plus, compared with the service sector or the manufacturing sector, their productivity is very high, and it's growing rapidly by productivity. Then, inequality probably comes from those kinds of differences, the speed of economic growth by sectors. And there's plus the number of people do not move from a agricultural sector to a manufacturing or service sector in India. That is because there is some problem in education system in India. So then I'm from Japan, and so when we see from a Japanese point of view, so in high school, their enrollment rate in high school is very low, almost 50%. And then 20% enrollment in university. And plus, especially in high school, there's no technological score or like that. So in Japan, there are several schools which provide services, professional services, to train people to become technicians or a factory working service person. Then in India, they're only calculating and writing English. They want white-collar job, not in manufacturing sector or service sector. That's one problem. And there's a plus. And yeah, right. So I think that's better to understand. So there is a within industry effect and between industry effect. So Dr. Himanshu probably is talking about only within industry effect. And within industry, okay, let's say there's a billionaire in one service sector, and so there are very low income service sector person. Let's say Airtel low wage worker, and Airtel CEO like that. There's a huge income disparity between those two. And then so takes some much of amount of money from CEO and redistribute to the person who are employed in Airtel. Probably, so basically that is what we want to say. But I think from my point of view, so that can be fine from Mr. Dr. Piketty's point of view. But so in general, probably that will not the problem in India. So the major problem in India is to move people from agricultural sector to service or manufacturing sector and to improve educational system. And probably this is my question and comments to you and related to the first lady person who made a question, what is the best policy to solve this kind of income inequality then? Yeah, so I want your idea. And plus, I want to ask you, do you have some idea for to make an analysis of between industry effect and within industry effect or not? Thank you.
I have two questions, one for Mr. Tarp and one for Professor Himanshu. A little disclaimer, I'm not an economist, so if the questions are stupid, you can just tell me and need not answer them. Mr. Tarp, you mentioned about this 1986 to 2016 individual X from going from 1 to 4, 8 and 10, 20, 40, 80 and 100, 200 and all that. Whereas in terms of the multiplication factor, yes, they remain equal. 1 to 100, 2 to 200, 4 to 400, 8 to 800. But if you look at it in absolute terms, in 1986, individual X was poorer by $99 as compared with individual Z. And today, in 2016, he is poorer by $792. So I don't understand, how do we say that there's no inequality? Inequality has remained static. My question for Professor Himanshu is, sir, you mentioned, I generally agree with your presentation because that's the general perception that inequality in India has increased. The managerial remunerations have gone up. The workers' remunerations have not gone up in that kind of level. The high rent sector also has grown, the billionaires and all that. But one thing that I don't understand is that the excess of even the domestic part-time workers to consumer durables like refrigerators and bicycles and scooters and televisions has certainly gone up over the last 20, 30, 40 years. How has that happened if they become relatively poor?
Two observations and two questions. The first observation is that there's a lot of reference to wealth inequality made, and it's made, even Rajat pointed out as to the data coming out of the Credit Suisse and Oxfam report on wealth inequality. You know, going back to what Shankar said, we all went to school long, long time ago. And at that time, basically the assumption, not the assumption, the conclusion was the major asset of the 99.9% of the world's population was education. And that has shown a radical improvement over the last 30, 40, 50 years around the world, especially in the developing world. So whether one should include the asset created, that is education, in one's estimates of inequality or not. Wealth inequality. Income, of course, it is included because it comes out in the income. Second, the observation is, before we conclude too much about development patterns and whether they follow a certain typology or not, the facts about Indian consumption inequality is that between 1960 and 1980, inequality dropped by a tremendous amount, dropped, okay? And this is actually in the WIDER data. You report the NSS data in real terms from 1950 to 1983 or 79. Well, if you now do the same calculation in real terms, then inequality in India, real inequality in India had a Gini of 0.3 in 1983, And real inequality in India, again the NSS data, was 0.32 in 2011-12. Now, by most estimates of inequality change, I think the closest one comes to is it was relatively constant rather than increasing. So that's the observation number 2. Third, actually, is, and these are the 2 questions for Himanshu, that you said that basically inequality has, not inequality, I'm now switching gears, to poverty has declined in India, but much of that has to do with the redistribution policies. So I would just like to know clarification, or you can refer me to a paper, as to the decomposition of reservation to, not reservation, decomposition of redistribution to growth in terms of the overall poverty decline. Now, while we're on the poverty decline, in 2004-99, I think the Tendulkar poverty line had 37% poverty in India, which had now declined to 21% in 2011-12. However, and Himanshu has worked on this data as well, if you now take a 7-day recall period for food, just for food, rather than a 30-day recall period, that poverty number declines to 11%. So we now have a radical decline in poverty. So if all things were going broadly wrong, what happened? Finally, on your Palanpur data, which is very, very interesting because it is the same village over a long period of time, how is that reconciled, which shows a distinct improvement, deterioration in inequality over this time period? That seems to be completely inconsistent with the national data on India, on consumption, everything with consumption.
My name is Ajit Mazumdar with the Center for Policy Research, a long time ago, an Indian planner. About the wider database, could I make the point that, of course, for all academic work, the Gini coefficient is the standard measure, and that's the measure on which most national data of inequality is based. But for understanding, or at least lay understanding of the poverty, Gini has a number of problems. One doesn't know where in the income scale the inequality occurs, and one can have very misleading conclusions from simple use of the Gini. So a lot of current modern work, including, of course, Piketty, rely as far as possible on the distribution of income by deciles. And you can then take P1 by P10 as the top and bottom ratio as an aggregate measure. And you can also do a lot of detailed work by comparing various deciles. Let me mention that the Global Consumption Income Project of the New School University in New York has built up a data bank on which internationally now they can give the per decile comparisons, and that has some advantages. The second point I wanted to ask was whether the WIDER database includes wealth inequalities or only income inequalities, because a lot of interesting and policy implications follow from taking up the wealth distribution as well as the income distribution and then comparing them. The second point I wanted to ask was I didn't get the, I've seen the Osterberg paper, the IMF working paper actually, not an IMF document, on the effects of redistribution on growth. I'm not sure, I couldn't follow. So if you, that the redistribution does not in fact affect growth, I'd just like to know that. And finally on Himanshu, may I ask, also put down my name as when you write up this presentation, if you do, or if you publish, please let me have a copy. And it's been most interesting to see what we plan to do, because I think for our Indian purposes, we need all that and more.
Let me thank all of you for the questions and comments. Some of the questions are obviously difficult to answer, and I think there are more qualified people here, sitting here in this room, who can give you a better answer on what kind of policies are required to reduce inequalities. But we do know, broadly, it's not that we don't know anything about it. We do know a little bit on what is there. Fleshing out the details may be a problem, but yes. I think the point that Sujit made about education is something which is, education as I said, we have seen phenomenal increase in education. And that's where I think I'm coming to the point of, from the representative from JICA. We have seen phenomenal, and the broadening of education in that sense has happened much more recently, only in the 10 years. And even in Palanpur, we don't see any impact of education as such in determining outcomes. But we do have a very, very strong, belief that it will play up a big, big role in the next 10 years. So probably that the gains of education broadening, particularly women getting into the workforce or getting into higher level. And in fact, remember, education starts kicking in returns only after the level of it. Up to the level of secondary education, the incremental impact is not that high. But after that, it's really, really high. And I think we are reaching to that level where your average number of years of education is increasing. We are still at a very, very low level of 4.5, something like that, is the average number of years of education. It has to go up, but once it goes up, then there will be definitely a thing. And I think it is related to that. But remember, education is also, which is highly discriminatory. It has a discrimination in terms of caste. It is also has a discrimination in terms of gender and various other things, which are their religion and everything taken into account. So I think to some extent, some of the inequalities that we see may get accentuated if the access to education remains unequal. Because education, if it is a leveling factor and it is something which can reduce inequality, it can also increase inequality. And in fact, that was one of the things that, and in fact, a very interesting graph that Piketty showed yesterday, which was that if you try and plot the children who are going to higher education colleges by income percentiles, you get a very neat straight line. And this is based on 2008 to 2012 US data. So even in the US, access to higher education or good quality education is highly unequal. And therefore, I think the issues are not just within industry. These are issues which are also important for people moving out from agriculture to non-agriculture. And if you are an agricultural laborers with a basic level of education, you simply cannot go and join a manufacturing sector. So there are barriers which are there, and the skill levels in that sense have to go up dramatically. But the issue of inequality, it is not just in manufacturing sector. And I think I had a few slides to say, it is across sectors. So it's not just something which is there, and it is within industry, but also between industry. In fact, if you just do a very rough, crude measure of per worker productivity in agriculture and per worker productivity in any other sector, that gap has increased by 5 times in the last 35 years. Simply because this happened till 2004-05, now it has come down, is because even though the agriculture output was growing slower, the number of people in agriculture was not coming down. So even the non-farm diversification was not able to pull out people from agriculture. So we still have a large gap between agriculture and non-agriculture sector, between rural and urban sector, within between construction and manufacturing, within services sector, between various services, trade, hotels, and restaurant versus other services. So I think those are issues which are there and much more complicated. We intend to flesh it out in detail as we go along. But I think the point here was that it is not just an issue of that you take from manager and give it to others. I think it is also a policy failure. Our tax GDP ratio, which is a very, very important indicator of how much are we spending, that has remained more or less flat. It has gone down, gone up, gone down, gone. But if you look at a long-term picture of it in the last 20 to 30 years, that has remained. But we spend less than 1% of our spending on health. China spends 3%. Other countries spend. Japan, you can tell me very clearly how much Japan spend on as percent of GDP. So if you're not spending on education, health, and other things, those are things which are issues which will have an impact on. So it's not just robbing Peter to pay Paul. That I'm not saying that that's the only way. It is also in terms of the broader policies of it. And those broader policies are important in terms of not just what is happening to inequality, income, and growth, but also in related to democracy. And we have seen an improvement, at least in our country, which is a massive. During the same period when inequality was rising, we also saw improvement or some kind of action towards increasing demand for these ones. So we had now more or less 7 or 8 entitlement-based programs. And NREGA came after 2004-05, NFSA came, Right to Education came, various other things have come. And those have now may yield at some point of time. But there is some evidence which is there, Sujit. I think we did publish a paper, me and Abhijit, in 2013 on decomposition of the PDS and MDM impact on poverty reduction. And our numbers were very clearly saying that the impact of PDS and MDM, the kind of transfers that went to households, poorer households, that had a very, very strong impact in poverty reduction. So those decompositions we have presented in those papers. But I think not just distribution, and distribution doesn't mean only the transfers in terms of social pensions and those things, but generally the amount of money that flowed in rural areas after 2004-05, whether it was PMJSY, NREGA, PDS, or various other programs, did go up, and that did have an impact directly, but also indirectly through raising wages. We might disagree on whether wages went up because NREGA created a floor or not, but there was some kind of an effort, some kind of an impact. It was also related to policies which basically created inflation, for example, the MSP policies, but it did impact in terms of shifting terms of trade in favor of agriculture. And then once it shifted in favor of agriculture, with wages rising, cultivators also benefiting, then obviously some of them may be fiscally undesirable, and that is where the real question comes in. That when we are looking at policy prescriptions, the policy prescriptions are not just related to redistribution and inequality. It has to take into a broader issue in terms of what is going to happen to growth, what is going to happen to poverty reduction. And poverty reduction and inequality are not incompatible. I mean, it can very well happen because the way we measure poverty, we are measuring in terms of absolute. So everybody's income goes up, then poverty will come down. So if it is 12%, it might go down to 1%. That's not something which is. But inequality may still go up simply because the people at the top, because when we are looking at poverty, we are only looking at the bottom half of the distribution. We are not looking at the top half of it. But people at the top may have got more than what the people in the middle have got it, or maybe people at the bottom have got it. So one is an absolute measure. We are measuring it in terms of an absolute poverty line. So when you're talking about Tendulkar poverty line or any other poverty line, then you are talking about an absolute poverty line. And that absolute poverty line will show an reduction in poverty. But that is not incompatible with increasing inequality. And we see that in Palanpur also. That people's general life has increased. They have now have better access to roads, better access to cycles, and those kind of things. But people in the top have also started. I mean, you have now more number of BMWs and more number of those things also. They're not incompatible. But the point is that if inequality had not increased, and if their correct fiscal policies would have led to better taxation or more taxation from the rich, then this number could definitely would have gone up more. I mean, the number of people who have been lifted out of poverty would have been higher than what it is today. So we are happy that poverty has come down. It is now less than 2, whatever number it is. But it could have been higher. So we might have missed the opportunity, and it is important to realize that we will not get this opportunity. I mean, we are going to get this opportunity, maybe, I mean, again. But remember, countries don't grow at 10% forever. So at some point of time. So when you are growing very fast, this is also the time to put in effort of reducing poverty at that, and I think the point is that these policies are there, these options are there. You spend more on health, you spend more on education, you spend more on nutrition, you spend more on gender, you spend more on hygiene, you spend more on various other affirmative action programs. You are going to get a result which is both better growth, better redistribution, and lower poverty. That, I think, is the answer.
I just want to add a couple things. We've been doing some analysis of the India Human Development Survey, which has two features that are not in the NSS and allows us to get somewhat more nuanced picture of what's been happening to growth, poverty, and inequality. Two features that are relevant are that it's a panel, so you can follow the same group of households between 2005 and 2012. And the second is that you have information both on consumption and on income for the same set of households. And there's a couple insights that I want to mention. One relates to this issue that has come up in the discussion, in the comments, that somebody asked, how is it that access to durables has gone up for the at the bottom end if inequality is rising? And also, I think Surjit was saying, how somewhat skeptically, how can you say that both poverty is going down and inequality is going up? So I just want to. No, sorry. Then I misunderstood your comment. I think there's the panel shows you something interesting, which is that if you look in an anonymous way at the two rounds, and you essentially compare Ginis, you find trends that are similar on consumption to the NSS. So there's in the IHDS, the Gini is going up slightly, which is consistent with what we are seeing in the NSS. But if you look at income growth or consumption changes in consumption for the same set of households. So you're not looking in an anonymous sense, but you're in fact tracking what's happening to the same households. What you in fact find is a high degree of mobility at the bottom. There's been much higher improvements in income of those who were at the bottom end of the distribution between 2005 and 2012. The reason, and so that is what is explaining, that's what's underpinning the very sharp poverty decline that we've seen between those 2 years. But the reason why inequality hasn't gone down is because there's a lot of churning going on. So if you look at a growth incidence curve that is non-anonymous, so it takes into account the panel feature, you'll find that it is downward sloping, so much higher income growth or consumption growth for the bottom end. If you look at it in the traditional way in which we look at these kinds of data as repeated cross sections, which is the anonymous version, you'll find that the consumption growth is roughly equal throughout the distribution, which is what leads to the Gini being flat. So there is essentially, the point is that you're seeing poverty decline, but you're not seeing inequality declining because of churning, and the people who are at the bottom have moved up. The people who are in the middle have not done so well and have fallen to the bottom end of the distribution. So that was one issue I wanted to bring up. The second thing with the IHDS, what you can do is you can run decomposition exercises to look at which are the components of income that are associated with declines in poverty or with the improvements in consumption. And what we find, it's a crude way of looking at the redistribution versus growth question. So is it you can relate the decline in poverty to the improvements, the increases in transfers, the increases in labor income, and the increase in non-labor income. So those are the three broad categories. What we find is that the main source of poverty decline was improvements in wages at the bottom end of the distribution. So the growth in labor incomes coming essentially from the spurt in construction activity does account for the vast majority of the poverty decline. And then that's followed, interestingly, by remittances, by growing amounts of remittances. And the third is transfers. Transfers have played an important role. You see that coming out very clearly in the data. But it's also coming from the I don't know whether you want to say it's from growth or from the fact that there are more favorable terms of trade for agriculture or rising wages for unskilled labor. But there is, you see all three dimensions firing, and that's what leads to a very rapid decline of poverty that we've seen between 2005 and 12. And then finally, on your comment that inequality has in the NSS is essentially constant. I mean, I think it hasn't increased that much if you don't, in real terms, I'm not talking about nominal, in real terms and including the spatial corrections for urban and rural in constant prices, so done correctly, you won't see that much of an increase. When you do it with regressions controlling for differences in reference periods, you start seeing more of an increase. But I'll share URP, MRP. But I'll share the paper with you that shows you that.
Between 1983 and 2011-12, unlike most assumptions, inequality stayed broadly constant, but went up from 0.30 to 0.33, okay? So it went up, but basically it's a very small increase given all of this assumption that growth has led to an increase in inequality. There is no connection, necessary connection between inequality and poverty reduction. So that's a simple mathematical thing. I'm sure I did not say that because this inequality has gone up, how come poverty has gone down?
How much was it in 93?
No, I'm very glad you brought up the 93 data. I think 93 it was 0.29 or so, and it turns out in 60 years of Indian data on inequality, the real outlier is 1993. So unless you want to take the outlier as a base, which also happens to be the lowest inequality India has taken as a reference point for all your calculations, be my guest. Yeah.
Annual data from the 1950s to 2011-12.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, so no, not treating it, not just focusing on 93 versus 2004,
exactly. So
2011. Then you see the increase, plus
please,
you see
let
with
me
the
repeat,
reference period.
1950 to 1983, there is inequality decline systematic in India based on NSS data, whose real inequality levels are given in WIDER data. That's number one. What's my source for that? Number one, WIDER data on real inequality in India, 1950 to 1983. Then we have 1983 to 2011-12, where the inequality has stayed broadly constant, showing a dip in 1993, which is, I haven't found any explanation written by any author as to why that came about. Matter of fact, all the explanations were the reforms were introduced and this will lead to an increase in inequality and all the rest of it. So those are the two simple points. A flat between 83 and 2011-12, this is data. And between 1950 and 1983, a decline, a very sharp decline in inequality. I don't know what's controversial about that. That's just plain numbers. If you ignore 93, that's the trend I'm pointing out. It goes up from 0.30 to 0.32 or 0.33. You want to call that a trend? Fine. But I stated that trend very explicitly in all the comments I've made over here or anywhere else.
There were a couple of comments addressed to me as well, so thank you for those. So I start with the democracy one. So the source of the democracy index was this database Polity4, and it goes from minus... Is the mic on? Mic is on, but I'm not talking. All right, so the question on democracy. The source is Polity4 database. It's a combined index ranging from -10 to +10. It combines autocracy and democracy. And we use this in the regression. And now I think we need to interpret all these results fairly cautiously because first of all, we are not claiming much of a causality because these are associations. And then again, our sample size is fairly small. And then one also needs to remember that a democratic country, the fact that the country is democratic doesn't necessarily mean that it would redistribute more, because I mean, people might have different opinions regarding the correct extent of redistribution. For example, the US voters typically favor much less redistribution than the continental European voters. So it's not clear-cut that an increase in democracy would lead to an increase in...
You're talking about the degree then, extent.
Yes, yes.
What do you exactly mean by a phrase, extent of democracy? Do you mean deeper, wider, more often elections? What do you mean by extent of democracy?
Right. So unfortunately, I'm not the author of the original index, so I'm just referring to the others. So I don't know the index that deeply, so we can return to that discussion.
Likely, the executive constraints which authors have calculated by the extent of democracy, very likely, that's the variable. Okay. How much constraints are there on the executive?
Or some other international organizations, like in the Latin American context, there's a ZLAC which collects information for the Latin American countries. So, to my knowledge, if they report these desire ratios, we also report them. The question is that then what to do when they don't report them. And in fact, there's ongoing work by the former WIDER director Tony Shorrocks on coming up with a data set that has a complete listing of all the desire ratios. But it's not yet available. It's still a work in progress. We don't have, at the moment, we don't collect information on wealth inequality. Then there was also a question about the what we actually did with the differently relative to the authors of this IMF study on redistribution. So we took their computer code. So all the methods are completely the same. So all the regression commands are exactly the same. What we do is we change the data set regarding inequality. Otherwise, the data set is the same. But the source of the IMF, the source of inequality data in the IMF study is the WIID database, which has a lot of imputations. And we replace that with the WIID database, which doesn't have imputations. And it's a result of this change that some of the results in the analysis change. And the main change is that in the original analysis, the gross income inequality had a negative impact on future growth. That result disappears.
Okay, let me try to be very focused. Let me start by saying, point one, WIDER work is made available eventually on the website. It's downloadable. There are 150 working papers published a year. You can get them by pushing a button. The WIID is freely available. As from about a month from now, all OUP books published by WIDER will be freely downloadable. Books. So there's obviously no question about the policy is to make things freely available. WIDER is a public good. Let me just say that in relation to the comment from the gentleman from JICA, inequality depends on many things. When you do sort of get into the Piketty discussion, so on, you can sometimes sort of get the impression that it's only the capital or whatever. It's only what happens in the US. What we're trying to point out is just that what happens to inequality depends on a lot of things. Inequality is a function of many different things, and the heterogeneity that I was trying to call attention to is important. This is why we're moving forward now. We're trying to discuss what is happening in the 10 giants to try to see where are the things where you can make general conclusions and where is it that's really important. That what happens in Brazil is not the same that happens in South Africa, is not the same that happens in India, in Mexico, and so on. Now, let me just say that I think that one of the motivations for our study is exactly to try to point out that economists and non-economists sometimes do not get each other right. Because things that economists take for granted namely that we can speak in terms of relative inequality and we understand what it means, sometimes is not understood in the same way by non-economists. I'm brought up as an economist. I understand what it means that relative inequality remains the same, but I do recognize that that is sometimes a bit of an odd kind of concept for non-economists. That's why I'm trying to call attention to the fact that these relative measures need to be supplemented, but at the same time, of course, recognizing that these absolute measures that we're using also have their problems. I hope that at least give some kind of motivations. But it is a fact that when you take and you double the income of one person and you double the income of another person, well, then they, in relative terms, stay the same. Let me try now to just sort of mention one thing. WIDER does not, at present moment, have a database on wealth inequality. In fact, my predecessor took the tentative work with him when he left WIDER, and this is now situated with the Swiss bank. Actually, the Swiss bank annual publications are actually authored by Shorrocks. So it's not that WIDER hasn't been active in the area. We fully recognize the importance of understanding both income and consumption inequality and wealth inequality. But I want to sort of stress the thing is that it's not wealth inequality that drives all inequality. And I think that's sort of a little bit of an important point to keep in mind when we are thinking about Piketty and so on. Jukka already touched upon the fact that we don't have the decile information and so on yet fully up there, but we're certainly working hard on it. And quite frankly, I mean, I would be the first one to argue that we should go beyond the simple Ginies and so on. But what we have been trying to do is to show some cross-country comparative work and so on. Obviously, in understanding, coming to deeper understandings, you need both to look at the decile. But you shouldn't stop there. You should do exactly what Rinku referred to, namely try to rely as much as possible on information where you follow the same households over time as one aspect of what you're doing. To refer just to the Vietnam book that I spoke about, if you take the same 3,000 households in Vietnam from 2006 to 2016, the same 3,000 households, and if you make sure that you replenish the ones that drop out with similar households, what do you think? How many of those households experienced increased poverty? What would be, you say 0? Other guesses? As a matter of fact, the number that increased poverty in the Vietnamese case is about 15%. Yes. So you see, my argument is not that you should stop with the Gini or with the deciles. We should go even further. But of course, you contribute your studies one by one. And the new school has done a great job. I mean, I actually work with them. But it's just that this is one dimension in which we can increase. And I really, in conclusion, I just sort of like to say that it's not by coincidence that the indicator which people are talking about using in relation to monitoring the 2030 development agenda is not the Gini. It is actually other types of shares. Now, we can have a lot of discussion about whether the indicator that is now there in the plans and so on, whether that then fulfills the bill. But I mean, we do, of course, share the understanding of the data. Let me finally say that I appreciate very much all the attention. I think these are incredibly important topics, and personally, I look forward very much to being engaging on the Inequality in the Giants project. I think that there is a lot that can be learned by thinking about what happens in India and what happens in South Africa and what happens in Mexico, plus lots of other countries. So thank you.
Thank you.
No.
Dr. Acharya.
Shankar has the word.
Well, listen, we are, I think, according to my watch, at 22:05. We should have closed at 4:30. I'm very conscious that there's a great desire to both take in fluids as well as perhaps doing the opposite, but I don't know about that. So I'll keep my remarks short. I think this has been a very rich discussion, and as someone who is utterly unqualified to make any closing remarks from an academic point of view on this subject, but only have some grey hair, let me try and make those remarks by just sort of, if you like, sharing with you some takeaways that I have as a neophyte or an amateur at this business. First of all, I think it's terribly important that whenever we talk about inequality, trends therein, levels, etc., comparisons across entities, countries, sectors, whatever, that we be very, very clear about conceptual issues. And that, I think, came out in the discussion, which is good. I mean, you have conceptual issues of relative versus absolute. You have conceptual issues of income versus consumption, of stock versus flow, wealth versus income, and so forth. And so I think we have to be very careful on those whenever we discuss this issue. Of course, we can say that, and the newspapers will forget about being careful, but can't help that. Secondly, I think the quality of data, which is closely related to the conceptual issues, are terribly important. You know, I remember long, long ago when I was in my youth, wandering around the corridors of the World Bank and reading documents like Redistribution with Growth, which had just been written by some of my friends, that I think they've very clearly said that, look, when you are looking at income distribution, you should not just look at income that's recorded in a monetized sense, whether it's pre-tax, post-tax, whatever, but what about things that don't get monetized or are hidden monetized, like say, subsidized food, like, say, access to quasi-public goods or public goods, which are made available through redistribution policies which are deliberately redistributive, but they don't get captured in typical survey data. Some surveys pick it up, but a lot of surveys don't. And I thought that was, I mean, if we had more time, I would ask some questions of the wider data with respect to that kind of worries that I have. I mean, those are things that I get left out. They're also left out, of course, things like destruction of commons and environment, from which a lot of people at some point in time derived income. Third, of course, I think when aside from concepts and data, I think this kind of discussion drives home issues of the experiences across different countries. And that actually was something I felt was really quite missing here. You know, we had on the, I appreciate time was scarce. We had here, and on the one hand, sort of a use of countries as data points for an international set of comparisons, and on the other, a kind of India-specific paper. Now, the obvious thing that comes to mind, I mean, particularly when you get to the India experience and trends, and here I was very tempted, if I may take an aside, that before we come to any conclusion on this, we have to lock up Himanshu, Rinku, and Surjit in a room and then let them come out 5 hours later, very hungry with a signed joint statement. And until that, we don't know what's going on. But that aside, that I was very conscious that, look, I wonder, you know, okay, this is what's happened in India. Yes, large country, 1.3 billion people and all that, very important, and we still don't know what exactly has happened. But what about comparing it to, let's say, the East Asian experience over time, on inequality, poverty, inequality again, whatever. Because, I mean, I don't know much about it. In fact, I know very little about it. But my sense is that experience is very, very different. And it's important to know why it's different in terms of the processes that underlie the whole development story, and to try and identify the entry points in terms of potential interventions. I mean, a lot of people say, well, look, in China, you had free labor markets, unlike your very restrictive labor markets. That's why you get the kind of completely screwed up stunting of the organized sector in employment terms in India, and the very slow, extraordinarily slow structural change in the labor force away from the farming sector compared to every other sizable developing country. In China, you had a completely different set of opposite policies with respect to labor markets. Perhaps that's part of the story. Perhaps it isn't. I don't know. But it seems to me that that kind of comparative treatment would have been very, very valuable, which I did find missing in today's seminar. And I expect out of all the things that are out there on the WIDER website, I'm sure there are many of these, and it's up to us to look them up. Well, I could go on, but I think those are some of my takeaways, and I will not keep you from your tea. Thank you very much.